Sometimes it's hard to break old habits and just hop into a new game. In fact, some games just aren't even designed for you to do that. No matter how interested one may be in starting that new adventure or catching up on the lore that their friends love so much, there's often a large barrier for entry. Let's use a long series like Assassin's Creed as an example. Every new player to the series has to decide where they want to begin. So, do you start at the very beginning and get the whole story? Or do you just jump in at the most recent entry and understand you won't get what's going on the whole time, missing Easter eggs and plot, but still getting the new gameplay that you've been wanting to try? There's also the option of finding a midway point, and maybe you've heard a lot of good things about one of the entries from several years ago. You know that if you suddenly wanted to join in at Assassin's Creed Syndicate, you may feel something's missing. Sure, you can still enjoy the game, and if you're really interested, you can go read up the footnotes of the story so far to get you up to speed, but not everyone wants to do the homework just to play the newest game in the series. And some development studios say, too bad, either play them all or miss out. And fair, that's their right to want their story experienced in a certain way. But every so often, a studio will open up their property to a new wave of players, those who may have missed the bandwagon the first time around. That's what Santa Monica Studio has done with their mythological action series in the newest entry of God of War. This entire series of mythological games has achieved critical acclaim across 2 decades, with all main entries having frequent score percentages over 90, and even spin-offs being in the 80s. The latest entry has also been cited across innumerable sources as being 2018's Game of the Year, even beating out other fan-adored titles such as Red Dead Redemption 2 and Spider-Man. Let's figure out what Santa Monica Studios did right in bringing this hack-and-slash game to a wider audience to discover what's so great about God of War 2018. You probably know that the original God of War trilogy and subsequent spin-offs are set in the realm of ancient Greece, and the story follows that of Greek mythology, with Kratos taking on many of the Greek gods as antagonists in one way or another. In a change of pace, this newest entry leaps into the world of Norse mythology, with appearances or word of mouth around well-known Nordic stories such as Thor, Odin, Baldur, and Mimir. One great aspect of this game's compelling story is the lack of explicit foreknowledge that you need when entering the universe. The extent of your Norse mythology understanding could be limited to Thor in the Marvel movies, and that wouldn't be a problem. The writers approach the dialogue between characters as outsiders to these worlds. Even Kratos and Atreus don't know that much about these gods and local races, especially Kratos, having come from what feels like a completely separate planet compared to the dangerous tundra he finds himself in now. The best thing that Santa Monica Studio could have, and in fact did do, was making this reboot approachable to new audiences. People who knew little to nothing about either Norse mythology nor the God of War franchise were welcome to join in on the fun, and here's how they made that possible: Atreus. This entry in the God of War series is obviously meant to be taken as a fresh start. After all, it was released 8 years after God of War 3 and begins a new adventure in an entirely new realm of mythology, no longer focusing on the Greek roots of the original trilogy but a fresh Nordic setting. This allows any new players to jump into Kratos' story without worrying where he was in the previous entry. Without a doubt, if you jumped in at God of War 3 having never played a single title in the series, you may be a little lost. Maybe not entirely, but still, it would feel like you opened up a book to a random page. This new entry, however, feels like opening a new book by the same author. And if you feel like you may be missing out on a little bit of lore and backstory, have no fear. Santa Monica Studios has the perfect tour guide for you, and that guide is Atreus. How is Kratos' son your entry into the universe of God of War? Well, frankly, due to the fact that we have no clue who he is. No one does, whether you've played the previous games or not, and the real kicker is, Atreus doesn't really even know Kratos. He doesn't know Kratos' history, family, abilities. He's completely in the dark, but he's curious. These are the shoes that the audience will fill throughout the game. Atreus asks the questions, the player gets to hear the answers. Not familiar with the realm of Muspelheim? Don't know who Magdi is? No problem, neither does Atreus. I mean, obviously he's not an idiot. He's not totally oblivious to the world around him, and he has little bits of knowledge that are passed down from his mother before the game begins. And, side note here, you know what's great about the knowledge he does know? It's the information that Kratos is missing. So in one form or another, this information is going to be presented to the player to ingest. As the basic information is surpassed and the story becomes more complicated, you have the additional storyteller of Mimir. And I don't use that term as a metaphor. He literally passes on information about the Norse realms through the form of stories about the gods, goddesses, and races of the surrounding areas. Whether it's to clarify something for Atreus or entertain Kratos on a long boat ride, Mimir has the road trip dialogue to fill your empty spaces of travel. One of the greatest sins of video game dialogue is making your story accidentally skippable. I've played fantastic games with great stories, but you have to happen to take long enough at your task to experience the whole line. When showing those games to friends, if they happen to finish a level or move their character at the wrong moment, suddenly they miss a punchline or even a crucial piece of information, just because they didn't know they had to wait for it, and obviously this is not at the fault of the player. But once something like that happens, you're suddenly missing a piece of the game's experience. Crucial or not, it was unintentionally bypassed. The way God of War gets around this is by paying attention to when the player would be paying attention. If Mimir starts telling Atreus a story about the sons of Odin, and then the player docks the boat, suddenly Kratos may bark something along the lines of, "Stories are for the boat, we must focus on the road." And Mimir will pipe in about finishing the stories later. And as soon as you're back in the open water, Atreus will ask Mimir to continue his story, even reminding him where they left off. This is a fantastic, tiny little mechanic that does exactly what Kratos mentions, allowing the player to focus on the task at hand. If you're fighting Draugrs and reading objectives, then you're not going to know what Thor said to that one giant whose name you missed. Instead, the game waits till you're doing something much more passive. As an added bonus, it fills those otherwise wordless treks across empty lakes as you move from one goal marker to the next, keeping you entertained by lore that is freely presented to you to pay as much or as little attention as you feel necessary. And speaking of traveling, the Realm Between Realms is an excellent version of fast travel, leaving the level of involvement up to the player. Feel free to set your controller down for a second. However, instead of a static loading screen or even reverting to the tip screen after deaths, you get to experience any bits of stories that would otherwise tie together pieces of the God of War experience, just as in the boat. That way, no matter your preferred way of travel, especially after the Realm Between Realms opens up a bit more, you still won't miss any valuable information. This is a story about two people growing, as individuals as well as father and son. Specifically, a very different father and son with differing upbringings, approaches to conflict, and understandings of the world around them, regardless of whether or not that understanding is objective, or just due to their experiences and thought process. They're both full of flaws when the story begins. Atreus is quick to anger, which may seem like it comes from his father, who literally has an ability called Spartan Rage, but Kratos' anger is more focused, and as he explains early on, it can be utilized as a tool, but it needs to be heavily focused. Atreus is also very naive, and experiences the world in an all-or-nothing, black or white limitation, especially when he feels he is being wronged. Kratos, on the other hand, is cripplingly desensitized and disconnected, and while he may not be an outright liar, he certainly has problems with hiding the truth. The beginning of the game is a lot of, "You know nothing, Atreus, be quiet, stop being so excitable." And while you may know nothing about Atreus' mother, you understand immediately that the family relationship here is a strained alliance of begrudging respect. Throughout their story, both characters teach each other a little bit more of their way of life. They find a middle ground in who they each are and how they relate to each other in more than just a bloodline. This game is somewhere in a limbo between linear and open world. It isn't a plain point-to-point experience, but it's no Elder Scrolls-esque enormous sandbox either. Instead, the world of God of War is presented in, effectively, a chapter's worth of exploration at a time. You'll follow your objectives for a while, then eventually wind up in a large area, large enough to know there is content out there that isn't in your direct line of sight, something that you may have to go searching for. And the options are obvious. Continue on your main path, or venture off for a little while, either completing favors or just wandering at your own pace and collecting items. The little gifts of collectibles and discoveries of lore are enough to incentivize you into looking through those caves, but they won't overwhelm you or needlessly sidetrack you. This avoids the paradox of choice that some open-world games tackle their players with. By that I mean, if you open up a world like Skyrim, you may know what you have to go do next, and you may know that the world is open for you to explore, but where do I go? What should I do first? Well, there's no saying. And while that is a possible great aspect, and certainly something that many players out there enjoy, it isn't the end-all be-all of making exploration fun. Sometimes it's nice to know that there is a finish line. When entering a new area in God of War, Atreus will excitedly suggest the idea of exploring the area. Of course, only if Kratos wants to, and then it's left at that. And from then on, the player knows their options and the world lays before them. In this combat-centric gaming experience, the puzzles that are sprinkled throughout the world serve as a bit of a brain-stretching side dish. They're obviously not the focus, and they won't require all of your attention, but they serve as a break from the main course, and they're enjoyable along the way too, ebbing with the multitude of intense fights that will pop out throughout your adventure. In case it slipped your mind, just as it slipped mine while writing this analysis, the story, world building, and player experience are all so great that I haven't even talked about the actual foundation of the game, its hack-and-slash action gameplay, which, let me tell you, is no less great than anything we've covered already. This is just one of those kick back, relax, and kick-ass sort of games that you just get to feel good as you carve your way through hordes of monsters. Then, every once in a while, you get to fight something major, and maybe you succeed, but maybe you don't. At least, not your first time, or even first 20 times. Maybe you were barely hanging on to that last sliver of health against a Valkyrie and had your chances snuffed out at the last moment. And upon realizing you were holding your breath the whole time just to focus on the fight, you have to slink away in defeat and continue on with your main story, or go on an excursion for better loot to upgrade your weapons and armor. However you spend your time away, eventually you get to come back stronger, wiser, and better equipped, ready to take names and finally complete your mission. And it feels so good. Becoming stronger as Kratos and thinking about the ways your enemies move and fight is all such satisfying gameplay that it doesn't get old in a game centered around that very concept. Pile that onto all the storytelling and character growth through an incredibly designed, open enough world, and you've got yourself a great game. In fact, a game so good that players don't need to know anything about it before entering, despite it being the fourth main entry in the series. Instead, anyone can just have fun with the game, and as the story unfolds, they might get the chance to say, "Oh hey, are they talking about Thor right now? I've heard of him." And enjoy that little piece of information as they continue slashing through the undead as an anti-hero powerhouse. That is what's so great about God of War 2018. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming as we slashed through the greatness of the universe of God of War. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, The Binding of Isaac, on screen or in the description. And if you're still in a Sony mood, check out our video on The Last of Us. If you want to be a part of a positive gaming community, please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions, and tell us what you think about God of War, or even suggest a game for another video. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.